Good evening. I'm Scott Charles. I'm the Deputy Warden at Trinity College, but I'm standing in tonight for Ken, who regrettably can't be with us, but he does send his apologies. Professor Ken Hinchcliffe, the Warden of Trinity. Welcome. Delighted to have you all here tonight as part of our Gourlay Business in Ethics Week. Another wonderful event. This is event 4 that we're having here. On this day, May the 26th, Sorry Day, and also the 5th anniversary of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we meet on this evening and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and indeed any First Nations people who are with us in the audience tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gourlay family, who, without their support and the generous endowment that was made in 2004, we wouldn't be all sitting here tonight, and we wouldn't be enjoying the week that we're having, and we wouldn't be enjoying an event like this. That endowment, so since 2004, we've been bringing over distinguished professors from all around the world in business ethics, and what we thought, and they've been teaching at Melbourne University every year and Trinity College, and in fact in doing public lectures in a wider forum than that. And we thought, as part of our 150th celebrations, Trinity turns 150 this year, we would actually extend the invitation to them all to come back. And we're very lucky that most of them have actually joined us. And we've actually managed to also gather together some business leaders and thought leaders and different people, some of them who are with us tonight for this particular event, to actually have this whole week of ethics in business. This is the 4th one, as I just mentioned, and I'd like to also thank EY for hosting us in this beautiful setup here that you've got. And Mark Leslie, I'd just like you to perhaps say a couple of words. So Mark Leslie, a partner at EY.
Thanks, Scotty. Thanks, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Scotty. It's great to see everyone here and being back doing this face-to-face. I think we first tried to get this event here, I don't know, maybe Celia might know, a year ago or something, and we had to bin it at the last minute. Maybe it was even 2 years when it was still a bit sketchy.
2020.
Yeah. Everyone was like, COVID, is it real? Well, it was, it turned out. So, as Scotty said, I'm a partner here at EY, and we're really excited to be hosting you all tonight. Any role we can play in the Gourlay Business Ethics Week, is a real privilege for us. There's a really strong alignment between, I feel, EY's values and the Gourlay Charitable Trust. So, for those of you who don't know, our global purpose is building a better working world, and I know the late John Gourlay and certainly the Gourlay family would identify with that. It's quite extraordinary today that we are living with more people in slavery than any other time in history. And certainly, we as a business are spending a lot of time with our clients on understanding their obligations and their impact on society. So I'm optimistic that if we haven't already passed the inflection point, then the day isn't too far away. Certainly here at EY, we're really proud of our continuing efforts to be better. We've got a fair way to go, but we've recently appointed a Chief Sustainability Officer. We've got our own human rights statement, and we're reporting under the Act, which is, as I say, a long way to go, but a big step. The timing of the discussion is really pertinent, I think, given the modern slavery legislation is open for review at the moment, and I think this is a time for us as a society to really gather around that and influence the outcome. The other interesting fact is where you're all seated is a significant site for the topic. So in the basement of this building once was George Columbaris' restaurant. And it collapsed under a pretty high-profile wage theft case. And I sort of half joke about that, but I think for a lot of people, that was the first time they really broadened their perspective on slavery, and that it's not just something that happens in far-off lands and that, the garments you wear and you don't think about it so it's out of sight, but it's actually in our community here, and it's really prevalent. So I'm glad to see that someone else has opened up downstairs and hopefully are doing the right thing. For me personally, it's a real thrill hosting anything to do with Trinity. A long-standing association with the college, an institution that I owe a lot to, and certainly hosting an event associated with the Gourlay family is a real buzz, and I'd like to acknowledge the members of the family that are here tonight. Unfortunately, Jono couldn't make it, but my association with the family started with Jono about 20 years ago when we were working in financial markets together, and later various committees at Trinity. And I know that everything that John Gourlay stood for has been perpetuated by the work of the Charitable Trust. So I'll pass back to Scotty, but thank you everyone. Enjoy the facilities, enjoy the panel, and look forward to chatting with you over sharing a drink afterwards.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, EY, again. It was a great talk, Mark. Okay, I'll now introduce our moderator for tonight's panel on modern slavery, Phoebe Wynn-Pope. Phoebe's Head of Responsible Business and ESG at Corrs Chambers Westgarth. In her role, Phoebe advises clients on the broader business and human rights impacts of their operations and helps them adopt a human rights framework when assessing risks and opportunities. She's represented organisations at the United Nations and was a founding director of the Humanitarian Advisory Group, a social enterprise committed to delivering excellence in the humanitarian sector. She was also a Director of International Humanitarian Law and a member of the leadership team at the Australian Red Cross. Phoebe's worked extensively with government, business, academia, the media and the public to promote rights and develop the excellence in human practice. Please welcome our moderator, another Trinity alum, Phoebe Wynn-Pope.
Thanks very much. It's an absolute joy to be here tonight with everybody. And thank you, Mark, for giving us a little bit of an insight to the history of the building. I think as you said, it is a time in history where there's possibly more people in situations of modern slavery, what we call modern slavery, than ever before. And it's estimated that there's about 40 million people. And there's very few amongst us who wouldn't have either directly or indirectly benefited from that modern slavery in global supply chains and possibly even closer to home. So without wanting to depress anybody, but just putting this into a little bit of context before I introduce our panel members and we launch right in. By the time we've dressed and got up in the morning and had our cup of coffee, maybe a cappuccino with a little bit of cocoa on top, and then we've checked our emails on our phones, we might have benefited from child labour in West African cocoa fields, South American coffee plantations, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in the clothes you wear, perhaps some cotton from Xinjiang or some bonded labour from Malaysia or Bangladesh. But it's not only an issue that happens abroad, as Mark said, and modern slavery is on a continuum of labour exploitation, if you like. But, we could also have walked through buildings today cleaned by people working in situations that amount to modern slavery, the fruit and vegetables that you eat picked by seasonal workers, possibly in situations of bonded labour, and possibly even the wine we drink at events when we're out and about. So while our strong labour laws here in Australia really mean that we do probably have less of a risk of modern slavery, it's still estimated that there might be about 15,000 people in Australia in that situation. So it's a very real and present problem, but there is light on the hill, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to have a fairly free-ranging conversation, and I'd like to introduce our panel. So we have, all the way from Bath, Professor Andy Crane, to my left, who's a Professor of Business and Society and the Director of the Centre for Business, Organisations and Society at the University of Bath School of Management. He's a multi-award-winning author and teacher, as well as a popular speaker and media commentator, and we're very lucky to have him here with his 25 years experience examining the changing roles and responsibilities of the corporation in global economy. He's a member of the Transparency in Supply Chains Advisory Group at the Home Office for the UK Government and a founding member of the Data Strategy Board for TISC, which is an open data platform committed to ending corruption, supply chain, labour abuses and modern slavery. And then we have Kirsten Gray, who's also a Trinity alum. And Kirsten was appointed as Chief Sustainability and External Affairs Officer at Treasury Wine Estates in March 2020. And before that, she's been Chief Corporations Chief Corporate Services Officer and Company Secretary.
Key titles.
I'm glad I only had Coke before. At Orica, and before that 20 years with BHP in various legal and very senior legal roles. Kirsten has a responsibility at Treasury Wine Estates for the corporate governance, legal and corporate affairs functions, and she's a fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia. And then we have Måns Carlsson. We're very lucky to have Måns because his plane was running late and he's come all the way down from Sydney today. And he's the head of ESG research at Ausbil Investment Management Limited, following nearly 5 years as a senior ESG research analyst at AMP Capital. And he specialises in ESG sustainability research across a whole range of ESG issues. ESG being the environmental, social governance frameworks that exist for non-financial risks for companies. We'll be talking a lot about that today. He's also the chair of the Responsible Investment Association Australasia's Human Rights Working Group and a director of the board. He's also a member of the Federal Government's Modern Slavery Advisory Expert Panel. So you can see we're very, very lucky to have him, and on the steering committee of Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking in the Asia Pacific. So we have the academic, the practitioner and the investor. So we're going to get all the different perspectives on modern slavery tonight. I think in general what we're going to do is we're going to chat for about half an hour and then open up for questions, and there'll be some mics roving around at some stage if people want to ask questions, and if you don't, I'm sure we'll manage to talk for probably 45 minutes or until you've had enough of us, whatever comes first. But Andy, you've been studying these issues for a long time, and I wonder whether you could give us some context. So we know that modern slavery exists. How have we got to the stage where it's become such a big hot topic? It's a big topic for business, in society. We're thinking and talking about it. You know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was a very small group of people who were looking at these issues.
Yeah, how have we got here, Phoebe? Well, it's taken a very long time. I mean, if you think that modern slavery essentially started when, if you like, traditional slavery ended. So if we think about the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, it would have been 1833. Ever since we abolished legal slavery, we've had contemporary forms of slavery. Right? It's not that it suddenly appeared, it's never gone away. Right? And I think that's the first thing to really recognise, is this is a practice that is not new. It's a practice that people have been in highly exploitative situations for centuries. And what's changed now is that we've had much more focus on it over the past decade or so. But we've had rules and regulations to make it illegal to employ people in forced labour for decades. I mean, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, developed its Forced Labour Convention in 1930. Right? This is nothing new. And since that time, since companies have been working out what's going on in their supply chains, forced labour has been one of the categories in the kinds of assessments they do of what's going on in their supply chain. It's in all of the codes of conduct of any companies that are sourcing clothes, electronics, what have you. And it's been there for decades. But it's typically been a tick box on a kind of assessment sheet, and everyone's been thinking, there's not really any forced labour here. You know, we've asked the workers in the factory and they're not forced, and don't have to think about it any further. And as you say, it's only been in the last 10 years or so that we've really thought, actually, maybe if we ask a bit further, if we dig a bit deeper into the supply chain, we'll realise what's going on. And there has been probably a rise in the number of people in these situations during that past 10, 20 years as well, because of globalisation, right? That the more we're using global supply chains, the more inequality we've had in the world, coupled with restrictions on immigration, means that people want to move, but they can't move legally, so they end up moving illegally, which makes them very vulnerable to these sorts of situations. And we have much better kind of access, much better oversight of what's going on in other parts of the world now than we once had. So there's probably more of it happening, and there's much more attention to it now. But that means we have to dig deeper into supply chains to realise what's going on. And sometimes that means going all the way back to some of the products you talked about, right? We're talking about a computer or a cell phone. We have to go all the way back to when the raw materials are taken out of a mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo to work out what some of the forced labour risks are in that product. That's a long way back. And, it's no surprise that we haven't been on the ball in terms of recognising these risks until more recently. So that's where we've got to. And then we've had kind of regulation started, again, about 10 years ago, started off regulation that specifically focused on the label of modern slavery and particularly about how companies become liable in some way for what happens in their supply chains. Right? So it's illegal to employ somebody under forced labour in almost any country in the world. We didn't need new legislation for that. But it's not illegal for a company here in Australia to benefit from modern slavery in another country. They have no legal liability for what happens in that other country because it's not their supplier. Right? It's not their company that's doing it, it's a supplier in another country. And so that's what's changing, is thinking about, well, shouldn't you have some responsibility for what happens elsewhere? That's created this kind of demand for new regulation, and that's where things like the Modern Slavery Act here have come from. We can talk about whether the Act is good managing that accountability or not, but that's the kind of the ideas behind it.
Great, thanks very much. Måns, you're, as the key ESG lead researcher at Ausbil, and you've been looking at these issues for a long time. Do you think, I've written here, do you find there's an inclination to listen and act on your advice? Which is probably a bit unkind, of course, there's an inclination to act on your advice. But how do you see the roles of investors in encouraging, we're talking about the roles of investors and organisations like the Responsible Investment, the RIAA that you're associated with, really having an impact on corporate behaviour. So how do you see that your experience and what you're seeing in the conversations that you're having?
Yeah, I've been involved in these questions for quite some time, over a decade as an investor. But the broad-based investor interest has really come from the Modern Slavery Act, because suddenly there was a legal requirement on investors too. So investors need to report on the risks of modern slavery, not only in their supply chains, but also in their operations. And operations meaning investment portfolios. So as an investor, you need to understand what are the risks of modern slavery in the companies you invest in. That's the starting point. And I think we're quite a unique stakeholder in the way that we are both readers of Modern Slavery Act statements, of course, as researchers, but we're also, in many cases, reporting entities ourselves. And that makes us quite unique. When you integrate ESG in the investment process, like you've referred to it before as non-financial issues, it's something that's been on the rise for over a decade in the investment industry. You tend to look at issues from a financial materiality perspective. So do these issues change share prices or earnings, essentially? The Modern Slavery Act looks at a different concept, which is risk to humans. In some cases, I've heard people say, well, they're not the same thing. Well, I actually disagree, because I think there's a huge overlap, particularly for companies with consumer-facing businesses. The brand damage can be very real, it can be very time-consuming and costly to restore once you've had that. But to me, and this is something I've said for many, many years, I think ultimately it comes down to earnings sustainability. So if you have a business model or a supply chain that relies on underpaid workers, weak regulation, or even modern slavery, well, as in illegal activities, those current earnings are not going to be sustainable. And I can come back to this point later on, because I think one of my bugbears is that people isolate the focus on slavery only and not taking a wider human rights issues from an investor perspective. But anyway, we all have risk. I think that's a starting point. There's no company out there, including my own company, that's without risk. So from an investor perspective, what do you do about it then? You can't diversify it away. You can't say, oh, we're only going to invest in these companies because there's no risk there. That doesn't exist. Which means, as an investor, you're very incentivized to engage with the companies. And when I say engage, The most effective way of doing that is to try to put yourself in their shoes and try to come up with solutions that work for the companies, the workers, and us as investors. So trying to find win-win situations. And life as an ESG researcher is not always very glamorous. If I was a healthcare analyst, I might fly to Switzerland to visit healthcare companies on the ground there. In my role, I've often flown to places like Bangladesh, China, Cambodia, Thailand, and gone to factories. And of course, you don't get to see the worst factories because I know you're coming. You get to see the best factories. But by being there on the ground, speaking to NGOs, workers, unions, etc., you get a feel for the complexities. And I think that's really important for us to understand when we speak to companies. But more importantly, by seeing the best factories, you also get to see what some of the leading companies in the world are doing on responsible sourcing. Then you can take those ideas with you back to Australia and sit down with local companies here and say, in a very non-provocative way, and say, this is what company XYZ is doing. This is working for them. It's a business case for it. They're good at risk mitigation. It has positive impacts on labour rights. Why could you not do the same thing? And when you engage that way, I think companies do listen. You become very consultative in the way you operate. And in your introduction there before, you mentioned the RIA Human Rights Working Group. So I can spend a lot of time on these ideas. But there is a publication that I co-authored last year called Investor Toolkit, Human Rights in Supply Chains. So that's essentially a collection of what I think is good practices in various different areas. And I think if you work on a number of different smaller things from a bottom-up perspective, you can change the dial.
Yep, you can change the dial, that's for sure. I think the dial is slowly shifting. There's a long way to go. Kirsten, you have been with BHP, Orica and now Treasury Wine Estates, just for some kind of low modern slavery risk industries. I wonder if you could tell us about some of the challenges of actually doing this stuff. I mean, you must have massive supply chains, and how do you even just get your head around it?
Yeah, it's quite a prosaic set of considerations, really, isn't it? And yes, I've ended up specialising somehow in multinationals, and often wish that life was a lot more local because it would be a lot easier. And certainly in this area, that would somehow make it a lot easier. But just to introduce Treasury Wines sort of relevantly for the moment, some of you may know it's a listed wine company, which is headquartered here in Australia but has international operations. So we grow grapes and make wine and sell wine across the world. So we grow grapes in 5 or 6 different countries, but we buy wine in a greater number of countries. We make wine in 6, 7 countries, and we sell to about 70 countries. So we've got a lot sort of going on in terms of international supply chains, but also customer relationships. So we go back and we go forward. We have about 3,000 employees, but it's seasonal, of course, seasonal business. So when vintage comes around, lots of the grapes tend to ripen at the same time, and then making wine all happens at once. So you can't staff for that. So you have a big seasonal workforce, and often they're in the vineyard and are at the lower paid end of the spectrum. And then, of course, you have celladors and other things at the sort of other end of the business where you've got a lot of hospitality workers as well. So from the wine business perspective, you can see there's a lot of sort of opportunities for issues to arise, and we've got a global supply chain of the kind that you would expect. One thing you mightn't expect so much is, because it's not really apparent to the average wine drinker, is that there is a big international trade in bulk wine. So, sure, it's not the wine that you've been served tonight by Ernst & Young, because that'll be a very high quality wine. But at the lower end of the wine market, but not it's not the terrible end, there is quite a lot of wine made in one place and then shipped to another place. So you're not necessarily close to all of the wine that you end up selling. And so, that sort of adds to the question around the issues that you have in vineyards, which are a very long way from where your operations are. So, in practice, I think we're sort of what are we, top 50, I suppose, ASX listed company, so we're not the biggest end of even the ASX, but we have 6,000 or so suppliers. And the questions of, practical implementation are, of course, those that any company of a decent size has, and that is, how do you actually get this done in practice, and how do I persuade, if you like, and get hold of the resources necessary to do this job properly. And the challenge is to work through the establishment of all the right frameworks and processes, but then work your way through to the actual depth of inquiry and investigation that Andy was talking about, and that's taking us years. So if we have, for example, 6,000 suppliers at any given time, I think in the first year of review of the existing supplier base, sort of easy to implement things when you're bringing on new suppliers. You can do quite a lot of your reviews and due diligence as they come on, but your existing supplier base sort of sits there begging to be looked at. And I think we worked our way through about 800 in the first year, and then we're upping our ante and we're getting better at it, and the speed goes on. But that's going to take us sort of some years, if you like, to work back through just getting through our existing base with a proper review. So that's just the tip of the iceberg too, because the reviews that we will do at that point of looking at a supplier and what we can sort of tell about them are really scratching at the kind of first, perhaps the second layer, but going down further, or being getting sort of independent looks at how someone's actually operating and whether they're doing what they're telling you you're doing, is kind of another exercise again. I think it costs us about $10,000 to get an audit done of a factory if we don't have the capability of doing that ourselves, and that gets us a report, which then if there are issues there, of course, then there's a lot more time and potentially resources required to then try and address them and review them, and we don't immediately see an issue or a flag and walk away, because it's not often terribly practical to do that, and probably not best either for the overall outcome. The general approach that we take and a lot of companies take is to try and remediate the issues with the supplier that we're dealing with, and if we're a big enough customer, then that will be something that they'll certainly often try and work with us on. We can walk away under our contracts if we can't deal with the issues, but that's a sort of quite a lengthy exercise as well. So it doesn't happen fast, I suppose, is the answer to the question. The practicality, I think, mainly settles around resources and time.
The resources and time and the access, isn't it? So we had, I was talking to one of our clients this week who said, well, okay, so cleaners are high risk. So we have our own cleaners, we can talk to them, but surely all of our suppliers have cleaners, and then all of their suppliers have cleaners, and then we're up to like 100,000 cleaning contracts, and how do we know that our cleaning supply, the supply chain is clear? It's obviously, Andy, that's not really the point of the Act in some respects, but in some respects it is, isn't it? And then how you get down, everybody, you read modern slavery statements and everybody is saying, well, we've got cobalt in our supply chain, our electronics are really high risk, but it's quite a long way down. How do companies actually, having declared that that's a high risk in their supply chain, how do they actually do something about that when they're not the manufacturer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's an important question. The first stage is super important though, right? Identifying where the risk areas are. And you can think about that in two ways. You can think about what's the risk to us as a company, or what's the risk to the people in those situations, right? So where is the highest risk of human rights violations happening? And so then you might think about the severity of the kind of human rights violation, the likelihood of it happening, and the amount of people it's going to happen to, and whether you can remediate it afterwards. And so when you're thinking about cleaners, on the one side, you've got this problem of, okay, is it going to be lots of people? Is it going to be a very bad kind of violation of human rights? Is it going to be in the modern slavery space, or is it going to be just poor working conditions or low pay? So you can work out these things, and you can do a risk map, right, of your supply chain. And that's the key thing then, working out where the core areas are to focus on. Because you can't do everything, right? You've got 10,000 suppliers. That's probably just first tier, right? You go all the way back. You've got hundreds of thousands of companies in your supply chain.
I think the stress, if you were a purist, would kill you, wouldn't it?
It would.
Yes,
it would. I mean, you simply just couldn't do the day.
You have to risk assess.
Yeah. So you have to find where the risk is. And then you also have to think about, well, what can we do as a company, right? And that's about your relative size, typically, to that supply chain. And some of those suppliers will be smaller suppliers, and some of them will be larger. And some of them will be in countries where you can have some effect, and some of them will be in countries where you can have less effect. So in something like cobalt, you were saying, so cobalt, it's in many of our technologies, it's in batteries, right? It's a key part of renewable energy. And what is it, something like 50% of the cobalt in the world is located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the estimate is something like, I think it's around 30% of that cobalt from the DRC is mined by informal mining operators. And it's in the informal ones where you have a lot of these kind of very terrible working practices and people using child labour and forced labour. So what you need to do is identify whether your supply chain has those informal miners mining cobalt that ends up into your supply chain. So can you isolate the supply chain to work out where it's from? And in an ideal world, you'll be able to trace it all the way back, and you can find out where it is, and you'll work out that, okay, these are the informal miners, we're not going to use those, we're going to use these ones, and we can have proper kind of oversight of what they're doing, we'll certify it, and then we'll make sure that our cobalt is clean, and therefore our batteries are clean, and therefore our mobile phones are clean, or anything else. Unfortunately, what happens in something like cobalt, and it happens in many other commodities as well, like cotton and other things, cocoa, it doesn't have a clean supply chain from one place to another. At some place, it all gets mixed together. Right? So the clean cobalt, if you like, gets mixed with the dirty cobalt, and when you're sourcing, you have no idea how that's all mixed together and which stuff is the clean stuff. So the first thing you have to do is do that kind of tracing of the supply chain, and then secondly, you have to try and isolate a particular supply chain so that you can remove the dirty stuff, or you have to work on improving the conditions of workers in the dirty side. Right? So in cobalt, for example, what you'd have to do is work with the miners to regularise them, make them more formal, right? Ensure they become legal miners that have to then have proper health and safety conditions and all these kind of things. So that's your two options. You either try and exclude, or you accept that that's part of it, but you try and improve those conditions. And that depends on how much leverage you have to improve things. And you can do it alone as a company. You have limited leverage unless you're massive, or you can work together. And that's where the real possibilities are, I think, here, when companies work together, when they decide, we're not going to try and get a competitive advantage by having slave-free products. We think the whole industry should be slave-free, so we're going to work together. This is going to be pre-competitive, and we're going to then have the leverage of an entire industry trying to influence what's happening. That's when you can really make a change.
Yeah. And we've seen that in cotton in Uzbekistan, right? So it was quite well known that cotton coming from Uzbekistan was produced with forced labour. And just recently the ILO has kind of certified to say that now cotton from Uzbekistan is okay. So, but it's taken years to get to that point, but it does work. So the pressure is building. Måns, in terms of, you often talk about, or when we were chatting before the panel, you were talking about the different messages that go out to manufacturers and to produce suppliers sometimes to the factories from different sides of the business in terms of building and strengthening business practices to make sure that you're not causing modern slavery where you might be surprised to know that you're causing modern slavery. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's plenty of examples. Before I do that, I also think, now that we're all here from different stakeholders and different backgrounds, it's very easy to point the finger at companies, but we all have a role to play ourselves as consumers and investors in our superannuation funds too. So if we endorse business models that have a retail price that theoretically could not cover a living wage throughout the supply chain, then in a way we're part of a problem. If you look at a pair of denim jeans, for instance, if they sell for $20, you can probably work out quite quickly, without being a rocket scientist, that it's impossible. It's virtually impossible, hypothetically and theoretically, for people in that supply chain to have a living wage. So unfortunately, a lot of actions I see are often very patchy. It's at the first tier. And a lot of companies focus on that, and that's fine as a start because it takes time to build down the supply chain. But I think it's also very disappointing because if it stops there, and I think that's what we've seen in the 250 plus modern slavery statements I've read, there is a lot of focus on tier one. And in some companies they say we're looking at tier two, tier three down the line, and I believe that, and I have sympathy for the complexity it takes from a corporate side. But there are also a lot of companies out there who say those things and kind of stop there. We're happy, we've done our risk assessment, done. A risk assessment, in my mind, doesn't really move the dial. It's the actions that do. So coming back to your question, sorry. Yes, one example would be, and this is something I experienced when I went to Bangladesh. When I spoke to factory workers there, they said, well, often we get conflicted messages from the companies themselves. First, the ethical sourcing or responsible sourcing team arrives and they give us all these lectures and demands on what we need to do in order to get business. And we do that. We pay higher wages, perhaps. We install fire equipment. We don't block the fire exits, whatever it is, to pass the audit. And in some cases, they spend a bit of money on that. But in some cases, then the procurement team is incentivized on price, and they arrive and they say, well, that's great that you've done these things, but we're here to buy your products at a cheap price. So unless you give us a 5 or 10% discount, we'll go to your supplier down the road, like your competitor. And of course that builds mistrust. Then a very likely scenario is then that this factory owner subcontracts that work to someone else. So the brand company thinks they've sourced from an audited factory, whilst in actual fact it's been made somewhere else. So to make sure, these are not rocket scientist ideas. I just think make sure the KPIs for the procurement and responsible sourcing are the same.
Yeah.
That's one example. And there's plenty of other things we can do where you just make sure you send the right message to the suppliers. There's some companies that also survey their own suppliers to see to what extent are we part of a problem. And in many ways it's unintentional. I think very few companies set out to cause slavery. Very, very few. But when you have a very well-selling product and suddenly you think, okay, we're out of stock, we need to get more products very quickly, that's how you put pressure on a supplier to have a quick turnaround time, and that's where many issues start. So it's very hard to rectify that, but better order planning is one of them. But some brand companies, they actually ask the suppliers themselves, is there anything we do that causes you stress with a view that they're trying to locate or identify issues that could lead to other issues down the supply chain? I think that's a sensible approach. But again, these are very complex issues, and I started out talking about living wages throughout the supply chain. Of course, that's not going to happen overnight, and it has to be done gradually. But I'm just raising the point that as investors and consumers, because we all are investors and consumers, directly or indirectly, we also have a role to play.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask Kirsten a question about unintended consequences, but I'm just flagging with everybody that now is the time to get ready with your questions, if you have any. So, not that you shouldn't be listening to what Kirsten says.
You can do two things at once.
I'm sure that's possible. So, Kirsten, we were talking the other day about the unintended consequences across the spectrum, right? So there's the focus on modern slavery, but there's a whole range of different human rights risks that that might be there. But also when we're looking at ESG more broadly, so sustainability and everybody's moving towards a net zero kind of targets and to renewable energies, that brings its own challenges, doesn't it, in terms of how we do that. You've been dealing with this a lot, so it would be really interesting to hear how that arises.
And it's not just something that arises in this space, of course, in the sustainability thinking overall. The more substantive we get in consideration of those issues, and the more we plumb into it, the more these balancing issues arise. So just to give you another example, my viticulturalists our viticulturalists will tell me that organic farming of grapes is actually detrimental to the amount of carbon that you can sequester in the soil, because I won't go into all the chemistry, but there are always balancing outcomes when you're trying to manage 15 sort of different issues as you come through a broad, quite holistic consideration of what constitutes sustainable operations. And the one we were discussing is that we've set ourselves renewable energy targets. So we've set net zero targets for our scope 1 and 2 energy, so our direct emissions, and also the energy that we input into our operations by 2030. And a big chunk of that is our electricity use and energy use. And so we've focused on that as our first undertaking, and we've undertaken to use 100% renewable energy by 2024. So that, of course, means a big process of planning and implementation, which we're underway with, and it means a lot of solar panels. So it's not all solar panels. Some of it are a number of other things, but it does mean, and this is a relatively small number of solar panels in the scheme of things. A lot of businesses use a lot more, but we might buy, for example, 30,000 solar panels as part of that exercise. And I really must emphasise that's at the sort of lower end of the scale. And those solar panels, of course, raise all of some of the issues we've been talking about because they contain polysilicon, and a lot of that globally comes out of Xinjiang, and there is a big issue with the labour that goes into solar panels. So how do we try and assure ourselves that we have got our hands on some of the maybe 50% of solar panels in the world that don't come from Xinjiang or have their polysilicon sourced there at least? It's quite difficult. We're working with a well-known, well-regarded renewable energy both provider and advisor, and they send the procurement, the ethical sourcing team in, and they pre-qualify their suppliers, and so we then go through a tender and we work out, yes, they're offering us a good price, and so we run with them, and then they can give us, when we ask, because we've got our procurement code and we want them to comply with all our questions or answer all our questions around forced labour and other things in their supply chain, they can tell us where their components are made at the first layer. And so they give us a certificate signed by the guys who are in Southeast Asia, not in Xinjiang, that this is where these panels are actually made. And then we also get a second layer verification that the various components of those panels are made by various places, a number of them in China, not in Xinjiang, in other regions of China. So we sort of look at that and we think, oh, that's good. But that's as far as the verification can go at this stage in terms of all of the suppliers that we've looked at. So we can't know that a number of levels down that the components aren't somehow working their way from Xinjiang without a lot of work. So we're actually currently thinking about what it is that we should sensibly do.
Yeah, and what you
to try
can
and
do,
address
because
that.
it's not so easy to
It's
pop
not
into
very easy.
Xinjiang
I
and
can't
have a
actually I can't actually fly into China at the moment without a 14-day quarantine.
Yeah. Well, so you just get a sense of the complexity of, and what a great job Treasury Wine Estates, Kirsten's obviously doing in making sure that you're looking as hard as you can, because lots of people are diving into solar and saying, isn't this terrific, without actually thinking about it very deeply. So,
well, I think a lot of companies are doing what we're doing and encountering exactly the
Yeah.
same issues.
Yeah. So I wonder if there are any questions from the floor.
In Australia, where are we versus relative to the other countries that, it always seems with the Nordic or the Scandinavian countries that are ahead on this stuff. Is that the case here? Are there things we can learn from other parts of the world about how to do this better?
Well, I'll have to start. I'm Swedish originally, so I wouldn't say the Scandinavians are the better ones, because I will be arrogant. But I won't say that.
True.
No. I think you can find. I think you can find leadership in pockets everywhere. Like when I did that investor toolkit that I mentioned, which is available publicly on RIA's website freely, I found global best practice across a wide range of different industries in different countries. Actually, I think there's certainly some Australian companies are doing things that others could learn from as well. One thing in particular I like in Australia is the collaboration around this. Because when the Modern Slavery Act came in, I think many companies were very new to this. One sector I would flag that I think have come together and tried to do this together, which Andy was saying before too, it makes sense, is the REITs or the real estate companies. So rather than everyone trying to reinvent the wheel and try to look at their supply chains in isolation, well, many of those suppliers are common suppliers. That's a great example of an Australian leader, I think. When they've done that jointly, they've got to watch out in some cases. In some cases, you have to watch out for ACCC, so they don't get in trouble for anti-competitive measures. But I think in that case, I think that's worked quite well. They've also then worked with other stakeholders. Coming back to collaboration, it's not just within an industry, because we've also done that a lot in the investment industry, but also using other stakeholders. So the cleaning accountability framework, for instance, where they've tried to work with others like unions and the cleaning companies themselves. I think that's something I would like to see, because no government has ever been able to stop slavery. So I think it will be very demanding of us to demand that a company will do it. So I think collaboration, I know it's a cliche word, but it really makes sense in this way. And if traditional factory audits was the answer, we should have solved this issue many decades ago. So clearly something new is needed. And I think companies can learn a lot from each other. And the Act itself, the purpose of the Modern Slavery Act is to stimulate a race to the top. And I'm all for that, but it should be a race to the top of actions, not reporting per se. But I do think that there's pockets in Australia which are far ahead. I think European retailers probably have faced more criticism from NGOs for a long time, including Scandinavian retailers. So I think in the garment side, I think they're probably relatively further progressed. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree.
No, I would absolutely agree. I'd say that one thing that, in terms of the regulation, I think Australia would probably claim to be world leading in its regulation on modern slavery with the Modern Slavery Act. As you say, it has its limitations because of what it's achieving. And so in Europe now, in many other countries, there's much more of a shift towards mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, which is forcing companies to do the kind of assessment of their supply chain that's necessary to determine whether they have modern slavery risks or not, and then making them legally accountable for that action. And that's different from making them legally accountable for saying what they've done. They actually have to have done it. It's still not perfect, right? There's all kinds of limitations to regulations like that, but I would say that as an approach to regulation is more likely to push the needle than the Modern Slavery Act that we have here and in the UK similarly. But one place where I think Australia can be an absolute leader, we were talking about cobalt before. 20% of the world's cobalt is located in Australia, right? And this is the key ingredient in batteries, for electric vehicles and this kind of thing. But much less than 20% of the world's cobalt is sourced from Australia. So there's a great opportunity for the country to be an ethical source of ethical cobalt, right, rather than it all being sourced from the DRC. And there are various reasons why that's not happening. It's much more complicated to get stuff out the ground in Australia because of, all the protections that are in place, which are so important. And it means it'd be much more expensive to do so here as well. So somebody has to take the hit on that. But that's the kind of thing, I think, that, we all have issues about the mining industry and the kind of problems that it raises, but we need, at least in a transition, more cobalt. The companies are trying to move away from it. And there's a real potential source of more responsible cobalt sitting right underneath us. Well, maybe not here, downtown Melbourne, but somewhere close by.
Restaurant underneath us here.
It's quite interesting, though, because the mining industry and the way that it sells products, obviously the kind of history of the mining industry is commodity and their commodity pricing, and it sells through exchanges, and there's no differentiation between that product. Usually the differentiation is what's the freight cost. So, that's what determines whether you buy from one country or another, one seller or another. But, the sort of prospect of differentiated commodities, which are priced differently and therefore not on an exchange but direct, is sort of moving on from the way that a lot of minerals and commodities are sold.
So, Andy, I've just got a question on that. So you're saying about ethical, that in Australia we have this opportunity of
ethical mining rather than DLC, which is all very good. But then, what about all the people, the livelihoods of people in DLC who are, for them, without that mining, I know they might be paid a pittance, but it is their livelihood. They're living in a world where there's, we don't have the welfare state and all those sort of things to support them. How do we address that, and what can we do to ensure that we're not taking something really quite fundamental and basic for these people by saying that, we are providing ethical, mining resources from Australia?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, right? It's always going to be an important issue, and I think two things there. One is that we're talking about people in modern slavery, right? These are people that are not voluntarily choosing these jobs. They're not people that can opt out to leave them. They're people that are in forced labour. These are children being forced to work in informal mines. So there's a real problem there about the kind of degree of agency that anyone has. So it's not like they're having a great living standard already, they're being forced. But that's one side. But on the other side, we think about something like cobalt, the demand curve is like this, right? Because as we're moving towards more renewable energy, that there's enough cobalt in the world to supply that for a limited amount of time, right? We'll run out eventually. The question is not taking that demand away from the DRC. It's how do we get the more cobalt that we need? Where should those sources be? And so rather than force even more people into extreme forms of exploitation, we have the opportunity to give, more jobs to people in a more responsible way here. We can also do that in the DRC, right? But it's very complicated to do so.
And also what's likely to happen as more ethical sourcing opportunities arise, and there's people have got a choice of where to go, that the labour practices in the DRC could potentially improve. So, there's a whole range of reasons why the DRC has problematic practices, and, anyone who's watched some of those dreadful movies about that part of the world, like Blood Diamonds, understands that, conflict is fuelled by mining very often, and so it makes it very difficult. But they do have this extraordinary wealth, and they do have the capacity, and I think perhaps maybe a willingness is needed to fix the situation in some of these countries and fix the labour exploitation that is there. And, we see, for example, on the Horn of Africa, where countries are opening up their markets and saying, well, we want to attract the clothing industry, so we'll make the minimum wage $26 a month, which is not a minimum wage that anybody can live off. Måns, you might...
No, sorry, I just...
after
you, I just... an example, like a relevant example in this discussion.
So if people are going to Eritrea to get the $26 a wage kind of reduction in their production costs, we've got to try to work to build wealth in these countries, and it's all interconnected with the NGOs and a whole range of other things, so that isn't actually an option anymore, so that's not a way of attracting capital into your country by offering exploited labour.
And I agree. One of the hurdles and challenges, of course, is corruption in a country like DRC, and that also made me think of Bangladesh. So in April 2013, there was a building collapse which killed 1,138 workers called Rana Plaza in Dhaka in Bangladesh. I went there a year after, and I spoke to workers on the ground. Some people were saying, the Western brand should just pull out of Bangladesh and not source from there anymore because their working conditions are so bad. I spoke to a lot of workers in Bangladesh, and they were all saying, no, that's not what we want. In that case, we lose our jobs, right? They were living in squalor. They were being paid a pittance of a salary, like I think it was something like $30 a month if they were lucky, which did not cover the basic cost of living. They still wanted the retailers to stay there and source from there. They just wanted to have better working conditions. It got to a point where Swedish retailer H&M and a few others wrote to the Bangladeshi government urging them to raise the minimum wage. I think we're very rare to see an Australian company ask the government to raise the minimum wage in this country. But because they just thought, well, we want to stay and we want to provide jobs, but if the minimum wage is this, factories probably will only pay that, if they're lucky. So there are ways to work and stay. But then in a country like the DRC, and I think there's a big element of that in Bangladesh too, where corruption is in the way, it makes it very hard. I think that's always going to be tricky. And I think companies are often trying to do the right thing, but if you deal with a corrupt government, it's hard to make things happen.
Thanks. We might have one last question over here.
My question was in the same vein, I think, as the previous one and what we've started to discuss, and that is when we're thinking about slavery, mainly in the poor part of the world, do we also need to think about that larger relationship between the poor world and the richer world? I'm conscious, for example, that Australia doesn't meet its commitments to foreign aid that it made with the UN, and my understanding is that most of the rich world, doesn't. And, many of the countries in the poor world are countries that were colonised, and then we have a situation where we're going in from the rich world and saying, you're not doing the right thing. And I wonder if, they might say, well, okay, but this is the situation that we're in. And it's linked to that history of colonialism. It's also linked possibly, and they would argue, to that larger relationship and how that's working.
I think that's an excellent point. And I touched on it briefly before too when I said, I think it's almost arrogant sometimes by us to say, well, we're going to audit our suppliers, as in they are causing the problems, not us, in our buying behaviour, right? So therefore I think it's a good thing by companies to have that dialogue where they say, well, is there anything we can do differently? And I think certainly paying more for the goods they source is one of them, if they really want to see progress. But I've talked too much, so I'll let you guys have a crack at that one too.
It'd be great if our investors would tell us to pay more and increase the cost in our cost of goods.
But it can be done in a way that it can be done. No, there can be win-win situations. Like as an example, in Bangladesh, their factories are just horribly inefficiently run. Mm-hmm. And there was one UK retailer that came in and made the same observation as I did, that you can change the layout of a factory, you can do a lot of things, but we'll help you. but only the condition that you actually pay your workers more. And this is an extreme case, but what happened there was they actually saw lower quality issues, faster delivery times, and also lower cost of goods sold. But that's because the workers themselves were very inefficient, and they were probably oppressed and also undernourished. So to some extent, I think that there is a trade-off there, but it can also be counterintuitively a way to do it. Doesn't work maybe in viticulture, but in some cases.
I'm going to put my aid worker hat on for 1 minute and say I think you're absolutely right. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a withdrawal from the international community. There's been a reduction in the commitment to the values and the aspirations of the United Nations, and the UN targets around aid and development have been dropped, or the ball has been dropped. The targets are still there, and we used to have a sense that when you lift up people, that the whole world is lifted up at the same time, and I think we've lost a little bit of that. So what I see now in the private sector is where governments have been lagging on a lot of these things, despite the regulation that we see, business and the pressure on business to actually step up and do some good things may help turn the corner in some of those areas. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask each of our panellists just to leave us with something. So I had a list of things like either the thing that they're most hopeful about, the most intractable problem, maybe the thing you're most hopeful about for the future. Let's finish on a positive.
Okay, the thing I'm most hopeful about, it has to be this for me, is that 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been having this conversation, right? And so the awareness, at least, is there that we're starting to have the conversations, investors are having the conversations, customers are having the conversations, and companies are, and regulators are. So all the right players, are starting to have the conversations. But the thing I'm least hopeful about is we don't get beyond conversations enough, but we can.
Yeah.
And the hopeful thing is we start with the conversation and then we go to practice. And if we can get beyond detection to actually tackling the root causes, like Måns was talking about, then we can really see some progress.
Thanks, Andy. Kirsten.
Yeah. In the same vein, it's becoming mainstream, so that gives you reason for optimism. And I think perhaps my hope for the future is that perhaps we see more people like Måns appearing to talk to executives, on behalf of investors, because we don't get that feed from our investors on modern slavery at the moment. So we are starting to get it, in a more concerted fashion, but still not at deep level on climate and those sort of elements of sustainability. But we are not getting those questions in any taxing way at all from the modern slavery perspective. It is occasionally mentioned, but we very rarely get any testing question at all. So I think that the more that comes forward into the investment discussion, the better that companies will do, because I can't overemphasise the pressure on companies from investors around performance and cost management.
Yeah, thanks.
I think I've been part of a problem then, because last time I had a conversation with Treasury One, I think it was more about climate change actually. So maybe next time I'll change my tack.
There you go.
If hopeful, can I change that to wishful?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think it is. And sorry for rudely interrupting you before, Kirsten, when you talked about investors asking us to raise to pay our workers more, because what I'm wishful about and hopeful is that actually people would be willing to spend more for Penfolds bottle of wine, for instance. So you can actually, not saying that Penfolds has an issue with underpaid labour, sorry, but I'm just saying in general, right? Like companies themselves can actually pay or ask their suppliers to pay a decent wage and then filter that down the supply chain. Because if we don't, why would a company do it?
Well, I can give some optimism there in that we do. Good. We constantly, as a branded products company, we are constantly asking consumers what they care about, and it is blindingly obvious that sustainability is everywhere, whether it's at the luxury end or or the cheaper end, and it will translate to being willing to pay different amounts for the better products from that perspective. It's only in a small way at the moment.
That's good to hear, because I've heard that from other companies too, consumer-facing companies. When I first started doing ESG research in Australia in 2010, I think it was, I spoke to the supermarkets. That all three of them said, what consumers really care about is Aussie made and price. That's it. Animal welfare too, to some extent. And then we've seen countless of studies saying that consumers want ethically sourced goods, but unless they're actually willing to pay a higher price for it and actually do it, then we're not going to see that. So there's been a lot of studies done where they have said, well, yes, I would be willing to pay more for it. But then there's some businesses bringing up too where they build the whole business model around ethics. Like some companies take a lot of pride in responsible sourcing, and they make sure that that's part of their business. And I think we'll see more and more of those companies coming up.
I think we will, and that's something to be hopeful about.
Yes.
Exactly. Excellent. Well, if you'd all join me in thanking our panellists for their terrific...
Sorry, I felt like I was interrupting you there.
We've been treated again, so thank you very, very much. That was a really wonderful discussion, and I think that's your hopeful thing there, Andy, of conversations and making change. Well, we've just witnessed a great one, and hopefully everyone here is going away and thinking about something differently. Thank you again to the Gourlay family for putting this on. Thank you very much, clearly the panel and Phoebe, wonderful job. And thank you to EY, thank you Mark and for the premises, but also Kaylee. So Kaylee, who's been involved in it, and the team there, thank you very much Kaylee for all your efforts tonight. And our team at Trinity, Kate and Celia and Pippa and Emma and the team. So thank you very much. Now we have drinks over in the corner.